in a hospital setting, of course, you have a manual knob and you have a pulse oximeter on patient's finger. So the manual part of this is that you have to go in and check the pulse oximeter on the patient finger and make sure that are within the directed doses from a doctor. For a number of years, it has not really been relevant to maybe consider that we were actually overdosing patients. But as clinical research started popping up, of course, indicating that actually we are not doing patients any favors in giving them too much oxygen. We're actually harming our patients. Our closed loop algorithm, that's really the essence of the whole platform. But what that does is, of course, that is picking out data from a pulse oximeter and then really translating that into what is the flow of volume that we have to give our patients in oxygen.
Welcome back to another episode of the GS MedTech podcast, where I speak with industry leaders shaping the future of MedTech. I'm Dama Medarski, and today I'm joined by Marie-Louise Little, CEO of O2matic, respiratory digital health company. Marie-Louise, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
So we're talking about oxygen therapy today, and by researching and just purely understanding from a non-clinical background, it is one of the most widely used treatments globally. Why has it remained largely manual and unchanged for decades?
I think it's one of those that it has been the same method for 100 years. And so we have just been dosing patients with supplemental oxygen. And for a number of years, it has not really been relevant to maybe consider that we were actually overdosing patients. But as clinical research started popping up, of course, indicating that actually we are not doing patients any favors in giving them too much oxygen. Actually, on the controversial side of that, we're actually harming our patients. Then, of course, we started thinking about what other opportunities could there be in terms of just doing the manual. So I think it's really been a mind shift change to really reconsider the current methods.
And in your marketing materials, you're describing oxygen dosing as a fine balance. What are the real clinical consequences when the balance is off, as you rightly pointed out, in terms of underdosing and maybe overdosing?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things is, of course, if you are giving too little oxygen, of course, you're not giving the patient the right amount of oxygen that they need, which means that they would be out of breath, and of course, they're not being oxygenated as they should be. Now, on the flip side of that, if you give too much oxygen, for people like you and me, of course, it wouldn't be a problem for a short time to have too much oxygen. But for patients who are actually building up the CO2 levels or have difficulties in really getting rid of that, we are actually causing problems for these patients. So this is actually where we are causing mortality and morbidity for patients. So that's why it becomes really critical that we are dosing correctly. And I would say that, of course, if you look at some of the recent studies that have been conducted these past 10 years, it's actually also been looking at what is the right saturation level for patients to be at. And that number is also coming down. So that's certainly something that is still being researched. The clinical protocols are directing that patients need to be within a certain frame.
And is the problem here primarily technological, or is it more about workflow and system inertia within hospitals that has made it dormant and stale for such a long period of time?
I think from a hospital perspective, it's certainly that nurses are very busy with a lot of tasks. I think the whole issue in terms of that we don't have enough warm hands. Of course, the focus on an individual patient, of course, is less, unfortunately, and that seems to be a growing global problem. I think that is, of course, one factor. I think another factor is that actually oxygen requirements for the critical group of these patients is changing so drastically, so that it is very quick to actually be on a too high doses. So we would see that in more than half of the time for these critical patients that they would be not at the right dose. So I think really it is a workflow question. I think it is also the question about also being aware of the speed of changing in oxygen needs for patients.
And your history with the business is very interesting and maybe unusual for a lot of CEOs, because you were first involved as an investor and a board member before you became a CEO. And we'll talk about your background and obviously your experience further into our conversation. But particularly in O2matic, I'm curious, when you first looked at them as a business, what convinced you this was more than just another device?
I think and of course we will talk about that later, but briefly, I worked in medical devices for quite a number of years, also in operations, and I think personally what I've always really been fond of are technologies that can move with the market. So that means that you're typically entering into a market at a stage where the clinical world may not be completely ready. So you are starting with the early adopters, as we would call them. And as you move further into the adopters, of course, there will be different needs, there will be different requirements, different learnings. So I really like companies who are able to move with that, meaning that it's not a trick pony, but it's actually a portfolio, a platform of products based on the same idea and technology. So looking at O2matic for me, of course, the initial products that I saw was, first of all, a hospital product that was complete and, of course, commercial also available in Europe. And the other products on its way is the home product. So this is where looking into remote patient monitoring, looking into picking up data besides the hardware components and base technology as a closed loop technology, really came together very nicely. So that was what I really liked about this. And of course, as a company, they had already attracted some very interested clinicians who liked the technology and were doing research on it. So that's what attracted me initially.
Amazing. And I'm obviously curious to know when you're presenting or telling people about O2matic, maybe to someone that's outside of MedTech or potentially outside of the respiratory space, so they don't understand it. How would you explain the device and the combination that you're utilizing in your product?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you think about someone like Stevie Wonder, he was born premature. He could actually potentially see, but he was put in an incubator, and the thesis was that he had too much oxygen, so he lost his sight, unfortunately, for that particular reason. So that, of course, gives an indication of the importance of this. I think for a non-clinical or non-medical person, I think it's also fair to say that we know that our bodies are usually regulating itself every single second. So you will have an input and you will have a reaction to that. And that's pretty much what we're looking to simulate with the respiratory systems around O2matic.
So you're effectively automating oxygen delivery. How big of a mindset shift is that for clinicians?
I think that the fact is that they have to reconsider what they're currently doing. So in a hospital setting, of course, you have a manual knob and you have a pulse oximeter on patient's fingers. So the manual part of this is that you have to go in and check the pulse oximeter on the patient finger and make sure that are within the directed doses from a doctor. So I think that in itself, now we're telling them that actually it's not that you're doing things potentially wrong, but the fact is that we have seen that it is wrong in about 50% of the time, because simply they cannot keep up with the manual change that is required from the patients. So I think from a mind shift, of course, what clinicians are typically looking at is, okay, well, where's your evidence for this? Where's your evidence that by changing what we're currently doing, that you're doing something that's better for patients? So that's, of course, the first transition in that mind shift. I think the other part of this is to actually also train and make sure we give our clinicians good experience with our products, because moving from a manual system to now having a digital system that you have to operate it, and it will alarm, of course, if patient is at a point where it can no longer automatically titrate the patient. That's also something you have to get used to as a clinician. So I think the mind shift is, first of all, being able to buy into this technology is actually making life easier for us in terms of it's removing a part of that manual work. Two, it's actually also doing it better than what we could do ourselves.
Yeah.
And three, we actually see better outcome for the patient. So I think that triangle is the part that we need to convince clinicians of.
And with the strong clinical data that you're already having, at what point do you realize that evidence stopped being the bottleneck to adoption?
I think evidence in itself is never coming alone. I think we can have the world's best evidence, and you will go to clinical team and they will say, well, that's great, but it doesn't really apply to us for X, Y, and Z different reasons. Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, it's also about having personal relationships. I think it's also about really being very clear on our messaging and being very clear on how do we train clinicians. I think it is not a one silver bullet that we provide great evidence. I think we really have to work very closely with that particular clinical organization in order to get them to use and keep using the products.
Okay, and in terms of your clinical validation, what have been the biggest surprises when translating that clinical validation into real hospital sales?
I think one surprise in there is, of course, I would say that that from a hospital perspective, the request to use more automated solutions, digital solutions, certainly a request that there's something that would help ease the burden of nurse and staff in general, of course, provide better treatments. And of course, the point is when you then bring out that system and you're actually going to clinicians and say, well, this is actually the tool that can help you, then they may be skeptical. They may decide that this is not for them for reasons that they may not be very open about. And of course, in the good scenarios, you will have a very good and open dialogue, and then they would want to evaluate the product in their clinics. So I think my surprise has really been that even though they ask you for things, they may not be exactly what you bring forward.
And in those purchasing decisions, in your experience, what actually carries more weight? Outcomes, workflow improvement, or pure economics?
I think actually all of them, but I think it really begins with the clinical team really liking the product, and then they will carry that through. So with a product like ours, it's not about the pricing alone. That is never going to do it. It's about really what is the clinical effect and how well does it really change daily lives for healthcare staff and of course for patients at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I guess one of the biggest challenges that many MedTech companies are facing is being first and changing that mindset as well. But at the same time, that's the nature of the industry and how we are progressing and we're pushing everything further. What does building a market actually look like day to day for a business like O2matic?
I think it is again about going back, of course, as an early stage company. We have a very good, solid technology background. We work very closely with clinical teams in order to get insights into building this. One of our founders is actually also a pulmonologist, so he also, of course, brought a lot of insights into the development of this. And I think all around our network, we've had that all along in the technical development of this, and of course also in bringing forward what is the clinical evidence that we should work with. So I think in order to really get this to a stage where it will become a daily part of use, then it is really about clinical data. It's about training. It's about implementation. It's about us really speaking about this continuously and in different ways, providing commercial materials and really also being very focused on the ecosystem around us. Because I think any company who is new and is a startup and of course don't have unlimited funds, we have to think smart. And I think one way that we're doing that is of course also to create alliances with other companies on a similar mission.
Yeah, very interesting. And maybe to ask you to further elaborate on this, when you're introducing something new, always there is a resistance somewhere along the sales chain. Would you see that more from clinicians or from procurement or pure maybe guidelines?
I think with where we are today, the majority of what we have seen is that simply clinicians need to buy into this. And of course, this is based on the clinical evidence that we present to them. It is also based on what is the level of training we're providing as we're talking to them, as we're introducing this. So I think the key hurdle for us has really been to generate the amount of data and the level of quality in our data that is believable for that first communication for clinicians. That is something that we hopefully will have in the next couple of months with new data being published.
Yeah.
And that data, of course, will hopefully be able to be in such a format that we will have further clinicians buying into this and finding it interesting. And of course, also being able to go out and talk. Podcasts like this is certainly also helping our mission because we're talking about it. We're getting it on the agenda.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why I do this, to be honest. It's that sometimes companies like yours can only do as much, as you rightly pointed out, budget restraints and sometimes not having the unlimited resources. And if there is anything that maybe an end user and a potential investor can hear that they're interested in, it's always beneficial to hear it from multiple number of sources as well.
Absolutely. And I think this is just one of those things. It takes a lot of time. I think, in my experience, I think even having worked in markets where products are well known, but you bring in a slightly different product, even in that scenario, you have to go through, actually, I would say years of educating, communicating, showing the clinical data. When you then bring out something which is new to the market and it is pretty evident that this should make a difference, you still have to go out and create very good data and really provide a good communication pathway. So I think MedTech is just a slow field. And I think, of course, the big question is, how do you monitor success on the road? And that's, of course, also what we're focused on, is what is it that success is looking like as we're progressing this.
Very interesting. And what did your first successful hospital customers see that others maybe did not?
I think the first customers who really bought into this actually had an acknowledgement of the problem. So they acknowledged that actually dosing oxygen is critical. We need to make sure that we are dosing oxygen to the right level, and we need to do that continuously. We need to really have a focus on these patients, and they really also buy into the fact that the better you control that, the better the outcome for patients. And of course, can you do all of that automated, then you will have also a lower burden on staff, and you will have something that is actually doing that treatment much better. So I think all of what we're actually communicating, they would buy into that immediately. And then they would have trialed the product, and they would have seen the effects themselves. So that has really been the first customers who really buy into our messaging, buy into what it does for them. And of course, having trialed that successfully and seeing, okay, it makes differences for our clinicians. So that's been the main.
And mentioning first customers and your earlier comment about maybe sometimes challenging adoption, it was some other podcast participants have mentioned those statistics that basically it's about 20% of clinicians are early adopters and they're happy to engage and to adopt new technology as soon as it comes out. The remainder 60% then are those that really need core evidence to change their minds and to have that clinical data. And then the 20% that are left are those very hardcore that are going to be last to go. So it's almost like the initial batch is a little bit easier, and then the hard work starts from there on to be able to translate that clinical data onto convincing material that basically will translate it into a success, not only for the first customer, but for any other customer that comes after that.
Absolutely. I concur with that. And I think, of course, what we can discuss in that is what are the timelines. And I think even when you're bringing out a product which is, as I mentioned beforehand, a well-known product to the market, but it has slight differences, you will still have to go through all of that. Because there will always have to be someone who's the first to enter into that.
No doubt.
So the initial ambassadors, of course, will always be there. So I think for us, it's a question of how long does it take to move towards the right, to actually get to the good implementation of this. And I think with that, of course, is always a question, and I'll say as a previous investor, of course, the question is also how much money does it take for you to actually get to that point? And that is the metrics that I think is really interesting. And that's something that's because we're also very cautious of how long does it take, but also how much money is it going to take us to actually get there, and what do we need in order to get there. So the leaner we can work and the faster we can go, the better.
And reality is, if it takes too long, it takes too much money as well. The two go together.
Exactly. And you probably would have lost your opportunity, actually, because I think that the opportunity is also what is important. And coming back to the question that you asked earlier, what is it that attracted me to O2matic initially? It is also about looking at a platform that is doing something different. So there's an apparent problem. There's no one who's been solving it or even really considered looking at solving it in the way that O2matic has. So that is an open field. But of course, an open field can also be, coming back to the point, you have to now convince people with good data and good clinical evidence.
No doubt. And talking about obviously the interesting approach and the novel approach, you're combining hardware with SaaS and a data layer, as you rightly pointed out. How important is that shift for the long-term value of the business and of the proposition? So
I think when you look at just the value of the company, what we have, of course, is our closed loop algorithm. That's really the essence of the whole platform. So what that does is, of course, that is picking out data from a pulse oximeter and then really translating that into what is the flow of volume that we have to give our patients in oxygen. That's the heart of our product. Now you take that heart and you can put that into a box which would go into a hospital. Now current product that has been approved for Europe is of course a box that is essentially has a display on it, and that's showing what it's doing, and it's picking out data for nurses and doctors to do the treatment on. And that's really standing there updating every single second on the information that it's getting, and then it's giving that change in outputs. What we have in the home care system is a true remote patient monitoring and therapy system. And so the intention with that system is, well, we need to make sure we treat patients who are at home. And of course, we also need to make sure we can keep patients out of hospitals, because that is where it gets very expensive. And of course, we do need to make sure we can actually monitor those patients when they're at home. So this is where the element comes in about a software platform, about picking out data, being able to present that data to clinician at a hospital. So that is the other system. But then, of course, we're also looking at other solutions. So we're looking in particular on the emergency side of this, or transportation, whether that's inter-transportation, so in hospital sectors, or it's emergency transports or helicopter, ambulance, that type of transport. So that will really be completing the whole, wherever you are, you can have an O2matic system on if you need.
And you've already touched upon it in terms of scaling across hospital, home care, and pre-hospital settings. What comes first and why?
Yeah, and so I think the company has been shifting. Our original thought was that we should really focus on the recurrent revenue, which would be coming from having a home product with the data applied to that, and of course the platform for our software system. I think what we're looking at now, and this is of course also a funding question, but we are certainly seeing that there's a strong pull from of course both the hospital side, but there's also a strong pull from the emergency side, that there's really a critical issue, and the critical issue in the emergency side is of course also oxygen depletion, so that you need to really control how you are consuming oxygen in transport. So that is really talking into, okay, well, maybe we should start there first, simply because when we're looking at the remote patient monitoring and therapy side, sometimes systems are not ready for that. So we may be a little bit ahead of ourselves. So we may need to wait a little bit before we can actually truly start implementing that. That doesn't mean that we're not implementing, because we're focused on implementing in Denmark. We will be looking out into other countries, hopefully doing larger trials, also in other European countries. But I think our focus is certainly on the hospital first. It could be on the emergency side of this. That's something we're investigating now. We don't have the approved product for that, whilst we're in parallel working on the home product.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Remote monitoring is definitely becoming much more popular, and it seems like the future is going to be remote patient monitoring. That's for sure. But reality is that maybe not only from a product perspective, but patient mindset, we're not there yet. We are heading there, but it will be some years before actually becomes the norm, not only from a diagnostics, but from a therapeutics perspective as well.
Yeah, I think actually with the patients that we focus on at home are patients who are on oxygen already. So whether they use a concentrator or whether they have an oxygen tank. So they are actually used to being treated at home. I think the difference is here with our system. What I meant was that, of course, we need to also have a system that is ready to go and see the patients maybe more frequently than what they would do otherwise. So whose responsibility is that? And of course, then we need to have data agreements in place. We need to make sure that we have the data actually running exactly how it should be. So even implementing of that, be ready. If it's a 24/7 service, we need to also be prepared for that as a company. So there are a lot of practicalities that we have not yet set ourselves out to do. It's not something we could not do, but of course it is requiring focus and also funding to get there.
But I guess that's the beauty and maybe the interesting part of being a CEO at a business that has so many options in terms of where it needs to grow. So it's looking at it strategically and almost listening to the market. First of all, as you rightly pointed out, speaking with hospitals and understanding where the actual appetite might be a little bit stronger, given the funding challenges that every single MedTech business is having, allocating that budget into the right pot to make sure that you get to that end stage and obviously deliver something that should and hopefully will become standard of care globally in a very near future.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's spot on.
Awesome. So you've touched upon the fact that you're CE marked, and maybe to close the conversation on O2matic. Are you pursuing FDA, and what's the timelines on that?
Yeah, so we've just been part of concluding the 300 patient study that was led by University of Colorado. So that's under the SAVE-O2 AI is the part we're on, but that's a part of that. So that study is being published, we hope, in JAMA, and of course that will be the for hospitals who will be submitting that to publication. But really based upon that study, that's what we are hoping we can leverage on from that IDE to work on an approval. So that is certainly something we are working on, and of course we are hopeful for that. So in terms of timelines, we would very much like to hope to have to get to the US in 28. That is our focus. So that is definitely on that path.
And is this all part of your fundraising activity at the moment in terms of raising the money to conclude this?
Absolutely. So just my little advertisement here is that we are looking for $6 to $12 million. And of course, a part of that is to commercialize broader in Europe, but a big part of that is also getting prepared for the US and really be able to get that FDA approval and also have that reimbursement pathway in place and start having initial sales in the US.
And I think the other useful part is that you're a company based out of Denmark and you have some well-known MedTech investors on your cap table.
Yes, we do. Yeah. So we have IFO, of course, and we have T&W Medical, who is the family office.
Yeah, and obviously T&W Medical is how you've, I'm assuming, ended up in this hot seat at the moment. So you've moved from board member to CEO. What changed most in how you see the business?
I think when you're, I mean, that's not, of course, just at T&W Medical, but I think in general, I've been in as a VC MedTech investor previously as well. And of course, a part of that role is continuously looking for new deals. It's continuously looking after the deals you already have. So you are spread thin. And of course, going in deep in details in every company is simply not possible. So I think the difference in being operational and to being sitting at the board as an investor representative is, of course, the time that you have available. So I think for me, of course, the biggest part of that from a positive is that I'm still even more actually excited about O2matic. So I think it has a lot more potential. I think I really now feel in a different way that when we see patients, we see the benefits that we're making to them. We experience, of course, clinicians who really like the products and wants to see more. Just having that kind of engaging conversation is not something you would usually have in a boardroom situation. And of course, also having close interactions with my colleagues is also something you don't do as a board member. Yeah. So now I really know what is the good and what is the bad about the company. I think much more deeply than I did beforehand. So I think that's, of course, one big part of the change. And I think really getting that message out there as to what is it, the high potential of the company is of course my sole purpose right now as the CEO of O2matic. So I think it's great. I like being hands-on. I'm really happy with the company and where it is, and of course it is challenging to raise capital. Now I'm on that side of the table, so before I didn't have to worry too much about that, only for my portfolio companies. Now I'm a part of that, so that is being on a much smaller boat. Sure. So you feel the good and the bad much harder.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And if I may ask you to maybe further elaborate on decisions maybe that looked simple from the boardroom, maybe not simple, but obviously more straightforward, but become much harder when you're the one executing them.
I think I think this is, of course, where you also become passionate about what you do. So I think that objectivity is one that is easy to lose in part as you get into a CEO seat. So I think, of course, the decisions that are strategic, that you feel that you can see the benefit of doing certain things, and you can see that has long-term benefit. But of course, it may not be from an objective perspective the right decision here and now for the company. And that is probably where it becomes harder. So that's where it's really important to have great board members around you. It's very important to have great advisors around you who can bring that objectivity into it. So I'm very aware of that. I do want to be attached to the company because I really believe in it. But I think it is also really important to be remaining somehow objective, because I think that's where you make good decisions as well. At the end of the day, it's about business, and it's about changing patients' lives, and we can do that best if we create a good business.
Very nice. Thank you. And from your family office and board experience, and I'm curious to know, because there is quite a lot of innovation and there is quite good products and companies, and not every single good product actually gets an investment. So maybe if you don't mind putting obviously your investor's hat on,
Yeah.
what does make a MedTech company truly investable beyond a strong pitch deck and a nice product or good product?
Yeah, but I think that's the definition of what is a nice and good product.
Mm-hmm.
I think, of course, every investor will have their particular investment thesis, and of course, if you look at a particular family office, not just T&W Medical, it could be that they would want to look at something that's they actually want to build companies, and they
Yeah.
may want to stay in them for a long period. They have no plans to a particular exit. So I think that makes one type of companies. And I think, of course, if you are looking at a company that needs to have an exit because it's a part of a fund, so you only have a certain amount of years to invest, and then you have to build, and then you have to exit that.
Yeah.
Of course, you have to be very clear on having an exit path from the beginning, and being very clear about putting that value into the company. And so I think the question really about what is a good product and what is a good company, I think that is really coming down to what is it exactly that you want to do with that company or product. So I think for me, I think, as I mentioned beforehand, I think actually looking at companies that are adaptable. So looking at company that can adapt into also different settings. So it could be, and I'm happy to use O2matic as an example. It could be that the path we were talking about beforehand, about getting into hospitals, maybe a little bit slower. Decisions are taking a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you have a particular clinical area that is actually saying, actually, we need that product because it's really going to help us solve A, B, and C. And you look at that market and you can see that could also be a good opportunity. If you can adapt to that, with the same technology, then you're in a good place. So I think that adaptability is key.
Yeah.
But I think also it's not just about the product and technology and a great market, billion-dollar type potential. It's not just about that, but it's certainly also about the people in the company. It's about being open, and I think also being somewhat humble to also taking on new ideas and meeting people who may not have the same opinion as yourself.
Yeah, that's very valid, to be honest, because obviously you're not delivering this on your own. You need team, you need a group of good employees, but also a good group of board members, good group of advisors, and being able to listen and to understand. Obviously, yes, you are the ultimate decision maker, but at the same time, there is a lot of value in why you've brought those people on board, and listening to that guidance of theirs to a very high degree whenever you're making those decisions is important as well.
Exactly.
Very nicely said. You said being humble as well. I think that's something that you see with a lot of the successful entrepreneurs in MedTech that have maybe exited already. It's like, to me, it's always amazing how down to earth they are in terms of the pain that they have gone through and how they're open to share that pain with other maybe potentially similar co-founders or founders in businesses where they're doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have to say I'm looking forward to writing the book backwards. That's be extremely successful in no time. But I have to get to that point before I can start writing out how to do it.
But again, you're being very modest, Marie-Louise. I mean, when I've looked at your LinkedIn profile, the amount of companies that you have been involved even before O2matic is just impressive, to be honest. And obviously some very successful businesses there as well. And you have seen those multiple number of companies up close. And maybe to my curiosity, I'm wanting to understand what patterns separate those that scale from those that stall.
And I think actually that's a particular good question. I think it is about keeping at it somehow. I think it is about any company will have good times and bad times, but I think it is really about how you deal with that. That's going to get you through. I think there's no single silver bullet to any problem. We have to try to get around that problem. And I've seen salespeople. I'm certainly not a salesperson myself, but I have seen exceptional salespeople in my past and also present, actually, who are just get excited about a closed door, and they keep working at it, and they keep finding out new ways to go around it. And I think at the end of the day, that is also what needs to be true for successful companies. You have to find your way through that, because it is tough. It's tough on anyone. But of course, the more people you can get on board with your vision, with your direction, and of course, at the end of the day, get clinicians to buy into your product and like your product, then that is going to spread as well. So I think that's a big part of it. Just keep going.
Yeah. It's a very long process, isn't it? Unlike any other industry. Obviously, you start with a brilliant idea, and then you need to create a product to freeze the design on it. Then you start with obviously the preclinical testing, you get into regulatory. And even now in the situation with O2matic, you have a good product, a novel product that basically hasn't seen the market before, and at the same time you need to now capture clinical data so that you convince the clinicians that that's the right approach to utilize in their own environment as well. So staying that full trajectory of the product development motivated and on the ball at all times is something that is very impressive, and obviously delivers the end result ultimately for those that do.
I hope so, for sure. And we're not there yet with O2matic, but I do believe that that's, just looking at the patients and how we help them, that is really the key driver in every single day. The stories we hear, that is the fuel that gets us going, for sure.
And maybe as a closing question, a bit of a forward-looking analysis on the market. Looking ahead, do you believe we're moving toward a world where therapies like this become fully autonomous? And if so, what comes next after oxygen?
I think so. I think with the world we're looking into now, we're getting more used to digital products. Of course, we have been doing that for a number of years. I think we're getting more used to also, everyday life. And even in your own household, you may have some robots. I certainly have some. I'm certainly not concerned that they're going to take over the world just yet, because they keep driving into things. But no, that aside, I think certainly we need that. And I think really what we need to focus on is to get warm hands exactly where warm hands needs to be, and everything else is something that we should look for technology to help solve. So I think that that will become something evidently that we have to look at. And I think, of course, our system is one, it's doing a very small part of the whole thing around the patient. You don't need a human to keep titrating a patient. You have a system that works closely as a closed loop. It's doing it actually better than you could do manually, and it's removing that stress. And I think you can look all around the patient and saying that, of course, there are systems around the patients that we can autonomize as well. So I think that is coming. And I think certainly also when you're looking at digital diagnostic solutions, that's already also a part of it. So I'm involved also with another company called iNook that also have an autonomous diagnosis of the eye. So that's, of course, something completely different. But it is, again, removing some of that burden, that human burden. So you can actually focus on being warm hands and actually really looking at helping patients where you can't use autonomous solutions. So yes, I think it's coming. And I think to your question about what is next, I don't really know. But I think it would have to be something that is at that level of health that O2matic is on. So it's not taking over some big part of therapy or treatment for the patients, but it could be more on the diagnostic side.
I appreciate your views and your insight, and thank you so much for spending the time to share them with us.
Thank you so much. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.